Welcome, everyone. My name is Jessica Gaines. I serve as the program coordinator here at Acre, a Baha'i Center of Learning.
And I'm Robert Sapiro, the administrator here at Acre.
And welcome to Conversations of the Heart, exploring race and oneness. This is a collaboration between the Baha'i Publishing Trust and Acre. And this weekend consists of 3 different webinars, including this one, which is actually the last one in the series. We had 2 yesterday, and now we're so lucky to have this last one today. This is our 3rd year of Conversations of the Heart. And under normal circumstances, we'd be holding this on the beautiful campus here at Acre, along the banks of the Piscataqua River in Elliott, Maine, which is the ancestral homeland of the Wabanaki. We'd be having these powerful conversations in person, but obviously this is not a normal year. And we're very grateful, though, to have this format, which allows for more of us to be in the room together.
Yeah, we are very excited to have this opportunity to be able to share more about these questions. Acre has been in part of its mission since its beginning of more than 100 years has been to have deep and powerful conversations around various parts of discourse, particularly around themes of justice, nobility, that inherent worth of every human being, around resilience, and ultimately around the oneness of humanity. So these are questions that we've been exploring in various ways. There were, as far back as 1929, race amity conferences that happened at Acre, and it's always been part of the conversation. Of course, at this moment, it feels particularly acute, although it's been acute in our country since its beginning. And there's no, but I think we're all kind of particularly aware of that. One of the things I just wanted to acknowledge is you got a bunch of white folks who you're going to see talking today. And oftentimes when we have conversations about race, that's not the case. And part of that, it comes ultimately from this conviction that every one of us has to contribute to the solution of this problem. So that is why we're engaging in that way. And we continue to engage with all voices and diversity, and that's extremely important to us as well. But white folks really need to do this work. So,
yeah, thanks, Robert. So today's webinar will last for about 90 minutes. We'll have a presentation by JoAnn, followed by a brief time for Q&A. If you have questions, just take your cursor, move it down to the bottom of your screen, and some icons should pop up. One of them is a chat icon. Click on that, and a panel on the right-hand side will come up, and you can put your questions in there, and your questions will be sent just to the panelists. And I'll be scanning for questions, for pertinent questions, and at the end, I'll field some of those questions to JoAnn if we have time, and she'll answer your questions. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Chris Martin. He's the editor for the Baha'i Publishing Trust.
Dear friends, it is a privilege and an honor for me to introduce our next author, JoAnn Borovicka, with whom I have worked previously. JoAnn is a freelance researcher, writer, and educational consultant whose creative ventures have included immersion in a wide range of subjects, as well as performing in visual art forms. She is the author of Light of the Kingdom, Biblical Topics in the Baha'i Writings, and additional interfaith works, a presenter at theology colloquiums and other venues, and a prolific mixed media artist. She has served in a number of elected and appointed positions in service to the Baha'i faith. When not globe hopping to visit their world citizen children, she and her husband Mike live in Greenville, South Carolina, where they enjoy the antics of their miniature schnauzer, Juniper. I had the privilege of working with JoAnn as the editor of her most recent book, Crossing the Line, a memoir of race, religion, and change, which she co-authored with Richard Abercrombie, and which was published by Baha'i Publishing in 2019. The book tells the story of Richard's life growing up in South Carolina. One thing that impressed me right from the start was JoAnn's sensitivity toward maintaining Richard's distinct voice and ensuring that his story was told in his own style of speaking. What emerged from her and Richard's collaboration was a heartfelt, moving account of Richard's life as he confronted racial prejudice on a daily basis and worked for racial equality and social justice for himself, his family, and his community. In the current climate of our nation, the work of JoAnn and Richard feels especially relevant and can benefit anyone of any race, background, or religion in understanding the social and racial dynamics still at work in our nation today. Please help me welcome Ms. JoAnn Borovicka.
Thank you, Chris, and thank you for everything that you did in editing and consulting with Rick and I that helped get this book together and in print. So, learning about whiteness through a Black man's story. I had the great bounty of working with Richard Abercrombie in the writing of his memoirs, Crossing the Line, a memoir of race, religion, and change. And I am happy to share with you some of the things that I learned in this 3-year process. First, an overview of this presentation. I'll be giving an introduction to Crossing the Line, and then describe what our collaboration looked like. And then I'm going to introduce some burning questions that came to me in the process of interviewing people and working on this book. Then that'll bring us to the topics of structural racism and the sense of white superiority. And then finally, the paradox of white progressives and what to do about it. So here we go. Introduction to Crossing the Line. At age 14, Richard or Rick or Ricky Abercrombie was besieged by racial prejudice because of his multiracial background, and he was frustrated by unsatisfactory answers to his heartfelt questions about religious truth. The time was 1960, and the place was Greenville, South Carolina. So we're in the Deep South. In his hopelessness, Rick began carrying a gun, skipping school, and numbing his emotional pain with alcohol. His parents were worried and his future looked bleak. As Rick says, he was headed to jail or an early grave. What happened next? An invitation to a birthday party at the home of a Bahá'í family changed his life forever. Rick became intrigued by Bahá'í teachings on racial equality, peaceful strategies for social justice, and the fundamental unity of religion. And this woman is Yule Labobo, who was one of his first teachers. As Rick investigated these Bahá'í teachings, he experienced a profound spiritual awakening that led him to give up the gun, stop smoking, and to engage in life with hope and joy. And here we see Rick at the top left of this picture. This is a Bahá'í group in South Carolina in the 60s. His family and friends initially opposed his association with new religious teachings. They thought he'd lose his soul. And they opposed his association with racially integrated groups. They thought he'd lose his life. It was dangerous to be associated with any kind of movement toward integration. But Rick's personal transformation and steadfastness drew his family and friends into investigating his new beliefs themselves. And I can tell you that there is a lot of drama and also a lot of fun involved in that. So to me, Crossing Line is an action story of teenage energy, despair, destruction, and resurrection. It's got science, it's got religion, it's got car chases, and it's a wonderful read. It's written for youth. It's categorized as juvenile literature. Adults also enjoy it very much. Rick's story illustrates the ability of youth to see the truth when other people are acting on hypocritical rules. It illustrates the African-American experience of racism. And in his book, you get a very personal view of racism. It's not outside commentary. It is a young teenager's view and his family's view. It illustrates the capacity of youth to take radical action for change. And That could be radical action that puts the youth and everyone around him in danger. Or that can be radical action that empowers the youth and contributes to the well-being of the community. We see both of those in the book. It illustrates the value of spiritual investigation, and that one should not be fearful of asking these spiritual questions that are heavy on the heart. And then it also illustrates principles and dynamics of the Baha'i community. So if you're not familiar with the Baha'i faith, this is an extra bonus of the book. The book actually started when Rick was on pilgrimage many, many years ago at the Baha'i World Center in Haifa, Israel. And Mr. Kaiser Barnes, who was then serving as a member of the Universal House of Justice, asked Rick to write his story down. Mr. Barnes was very familiar with the story of the Abercrombie family and with Rick's personal story, and also familiar with the tremendous bounty that the Abercrombies had been in worldwide Baha'i endeavors. And he really encouraged Rick to get it written down, and Rick promised that he would. Well, 10, 12, maybe 15 years later, Mr. Barnes asked how Rick was coming on that, and it hadn't quite come together yet. Rick had a start, but it wasn't complete. And that's when I came into the picture. Rick felt like he wanted to collaborate with someone to finish his book. So I said yes. Actually, it was a celebration. I'm a writer. I'm a researcher. I love a good story. And I'd known Rick for some time, and I already knew that he was a great storyteller and that he had a great story, and many of them. So I said yes. Now, we started with the outline that he had already been working on, and my job was to interview him and really flesh out and make this the interesting and exciting read that it could be. So we started, as I said, with Rick's outline, and then I interviewed him extensively. He would say that I interrogated him. But, you know, if it's going to be a good story, you have to get inside the character, and that was my job. I also interviewed Rick's family and his friends, probably a couple dozen people who knew Rick in the 60s, who lived many of these adventures with him. And their input was important to kind of jog Rick's memory. This was a long time ago. Also to get a different perspective on the same story and checking facts, that kind of thing. So this was wonderful for me as a researcher because I had license to ask anything. And so for 3 years, I was talking to primarily African Americans, and I could ask anything at all. And mostly we were talking about their experience of racism in the 60s and from the 60s till now. So this was an incredible learning experience for me. It was a bounty. Now, this interrogation of Rick, I mean, sometimes he described it that it was like he was getting his teeth pulled without Novocaine. But again, that's what he hired me for. And so in the book, these very, very personal information comes out, and it's inspiring. So I expected to learn about Rick and his adventures. I didn't expect to learn about myself as a white person through Rick's story. So I was asking Rick about his childhood. I wanted to get down in his words what it was like for him to grow up in a segregated society. And I asked him, when you were a child, how did your mother explain the rules of racism and segregation to you? Now, here we have a picture of Rick's family in the 60s. He's the second one from the right in the white shirt. His mother is 2 over in the white dress and his father in the middle. Yeah, when you were a child, how did your mother explain the rules of racism and segregation to you? Rick's mother said, "You've got to feed white people with a long-handled spoon. Be kind to them and give them what they need, but don't get too close." This was a loving mother's guidance to her children. And this is what Rick tried to abide by. And when I heard this, my blood went cold. In my bones, truly, I knew this rule and my place in it. It was like Rick's mother, Miss Lily, had just named the tune that we have all been dancing to for decades. This was my first moment of learning about whiteness through Rick's story. Now, previously, I have to tell you, I was not ignorant of racial oppression or the culture of white superiority. But I did think I was above it enough to not be involved in it. So I had early experiences as a child and youth that brought the horror of racial injustice to my attention. And it stayed in my family's attention. I'm a member of the Bahá'í community. The importance of race unity and the abomination of prejudices of all kinds is directly addressed in the scripture. I affiliate with groups that work for social justice and racial justice specifically. I'm what you would call a white progressive, or some may say a white liberal. And that would indicate that I believe that racism is immoral, and I do what I can to work for equity. But when I heard Rick's mother's guidance, I knew that I was a participant in and a benefactor of that rule of engagement. We'll get back to that, but now there's the second moment of seeing myself in Rick's story. This is an episode, a brief episode about Grace von der Heit. Now, Grace was a member of the Baha'i community in Greenville when Rick joined the community in the early 60s, but she'd been there for many years. Rick describes her as an elderly, aristocratic businesswoman from the Northeast. In the picture, she's on the left, she's in the dark suit, 3 down on the left. Grace was very courageous in her pro-integration activities. Because she was a bit of a socialite, the newspaper social column followed her. And she was very open with the fact that she would be going to say a race amity conference in Chicago or a Baha'i gathering in North Carolina. So this was in the newspaper. And as I'd mentioned before, it was physically dangerous to be associated with any efforts toward integration. So Grace was courageous. She too would be described as a white progressive. She had moved to Greenville, South Carolina from the Northeast to help build the Baha'i community there. And it did grow. Rick, in the early 60s, was part of the fruits of their efforts. And with Rick, when he joined the community, he taught his friends and family. And so within a very short time of his joining, the community doubled in size, and it grew from a small group of mostly white elderly people to an equal amount and more of adolescent African Americans. So the community really grew and changed. But the African American youth who were new to the Greenville Baha'i community felt that Grace von der Heit was prejudiced. So they did not, they noticed that she did not offer them rides and a few other things in her attitudes and actions. And they confronted her about it at a Baha'i meeting. Grace's response to the accusation that she was prejudiced was, yes, I am prejudiced, and I'm trying to do something about it. Now, with Rick telling this story, it was interesting that afterwards, after her declaration, the youth never had any problem with her after that. And Rick, I can't tell you how much admiration and love he has for Grace von der Heit. And it caught my attention and I just couldn't let this go. So, I mean, my question was, how could Grace be prejudiced, first of all, when she worked so selflessly in the Baha'i community? And if she was prejudiced, why did Rick admire her so much? Right? I mean, she should have abandoned those prejudicial feelings. In the Baha'i writings, this is from Baha'u'llah, the prophet founder of the Baha'i faith, he states, "O humankind, associate in friendship, love one another, abandon prejudice of race, dispel forever this gloomy darkness of human ignorance." Okay, so the racial prejudice is an abomination in the Baha'i faith. How could Grace be prejudiced? And why did they admire her when she admitted it? We'll get back to that as well. Now, here's the third moment of seeing myself. This is an episode of the 1969 Youth Conference that was held with the National Spiritual Assembly of the Baha'is of the United States. So the National Assembly in 1969, in the fall, they invited certain Baha'i youth, all African Americans, who were at the vanguard of the civil rights movement. They invited them to come to the National Assembly headquarters to consult about best practices in civil rights work. As you know, this was a very tumultuous time and a dangerous time, and youth students were often at the spearhead of organizing civil rights activities and engaging in them. So the National Assembly wanted to consult with the youth to make sure that their activities were, to guide them, so their activities were within Baha'i standards of absolute nonviolence, and also to help them so that their efforts would be successful. And this is, I love this picture. This is a snapshot of some of the youth that were at that conference. And to find out who they were, you're going to have to buy the book. So at the conference, concerns of the youth included: how could the community move forward when many white Baha'is were blind to the reality of racial oppression, as well as blind to their own prejudicial attitudes and actions? Now, I felt like this was tattooed onto my arm. I couldn't leave this alone because, first of all, if you're a member of the Baha'i faith, you know that racial prejudice exists and that it's wrong, and you should work to not be prejudiced. At this time in the 60s, it was dangerous to be a Baha'i because Baha'is were associated with integration. So why were there white Baha'is who were blind to racial oppression? And why did they have prejudicial actions and attitudes? So my question about Grace sort of expanded. And as I worked on Rick's book, this concern of the youth, the blindness of many white Baha'is to their own racist attitudes and actions, got louder in my head. And you know, these youth, they weren't from one community, they were from all over the country. Why is this a phenomenon that they identified everywhere? As I thought about this, I recalled hearing the exact same concern voiced by people of color over the past 20 years in different situations, such as national conventions, task groups, and trainings. And those voices got louder. Although I realized that although I had heard the concern before, I put myself out of it. I was like, I can't be one of those white people who don't see their own racist attitudes or actions. So my question about grace was enlarged to, why are so many white progressives blind to their own racist attitudes and actions? And could I be blind to my own racist attitudes and actions? Okay, so I found answers to this in the Baha'i writings and also in contemporary literature. So the research of social scientists, racial justice educators, psychiatrists, multicultural specialists, there is a lot of literature out there now, widely available on just this topic. So briefly, so many white progressives are blind to their own racist attitudes and actions because structural racism permeates everything. Nobody escapes being socialized into a system of structural racism in America. And white people are socialized into a sense of white superiority, whether we know it or not. And we are programmed to be blind to it. That's part of the socialization. Yes. So, could I have racist attitudes and actions as a Baha'i and a white progressive? The answer is yes. Grace knew that she did. Okay, so let's look at the topic of structural racism from the Baha'i writings. What is this? As to racial prejudice, Shoghi Effendi states, the corrosion of which has bitten into the fiber and attacked the whole structure of American society, it should be regarded as constituting the most vital and challenging issue. And he goes on to say, confronting the American Baha'i community. So let's look closely at some of these words. Racial prejudice, it is a corrosion that's attacked the whole structure. There's no choice of, well, it's this, but not that. The entire structure is corroded. Let's look at the metaphor of a house. If the whole house is corroded, all the inhabitants are going to be affected. Corrosion brings disease. Top left, these are corroded water pipes. You drink water from corroded water pipes, and your system is going to be affected in a major way. You're going to get sick. Bottom right, corroded ductwork. If you breathe air that comes out of this ductwork that is corroded, and then there's mold growing in there and any number of things, you will suffer disease. It will come onto you invisibly, but you will be sick. When the whole structure is corroded, everybody gets sick. This view of structural racism is echoed in the current social sciences. This is just one example, quote, structural racism is not something that a few people or institutions choose to practice. It has been a feature of the social, economic, and political systems in which we all exist. This is just one example of many of the current literature on the pervasive nature of structural racism. Could also call it systemic racism. It's through the whole system, as described by Shoghi Effendi in the 1930s. And now let's look at the sense of white superiority as described in the Baha'i writings. Shoghi Effendi states, and the context is to contribute to the solution of this problem, what should white people do? He states, let the white make a supreme effort in their resolve to contribute their share to the solution of this problem, to abandon once and for all their usually inherent and at times subconscious sense of superiority. Now, keep in mind, Shoghi Effendi has just declared racial prejudice as the most vital and challenging issue. And then he comes with this follows, what is the one first thing that white people should do? Of all the possibilities, he states it is to abandon their usually inherent and at times subconscious sense of superiority. This is a foundational factor of structural racism. This sense of superiority is what structural racism is built on. And look how it's described. Inherent. An inherent, I looked up inherent. Inherent means existing in something as a permanent, essential, or characteristic attribute. Shoghi Effendi says it's usually inherent. Usually is a big word. Usually is most of the time. So usually also allows for not always. And this is how I read this passage in the past, actually. It's like, yeah, it's too bad that some of those white people have this inherent sense of superiority. I don't have that. You know, the usually kind of gives us an out. And it says at times subconscious. So subconscious, you look at an iceberg, subconscious is what's below the water line. It's things that are there, it's holding it up, but you not really aware of it. I was sure that I didn't have a subconscious sense of white superiority. Wasn't conscious of that. So I think the way that he describes this is very intriguing. And we have to remember that when it comes to the sense of white superiority, we have this inherent and subconscious thing going on. Okay. Now, I think that most white progressives see themselves as the exception to the rule. Shoghi Effendi says it's usually inherent and at times subconscious. So yes, I'm the bunny in the midst of the stormtroopers going, yeah, it's not me. But I'm looking at this very, very differently now. I think that usually inherent there, I'm not sure what the conditions would be where it wasn't. And at times subconscious, I'm learning that is probably always subconscious because we've been socialized into it. This phenomenon can be studied with the benefit of decades of research because unlike 50 years ago, whiteness studies are now a thing. And you might think, why do we need whiteness studies? Eurocentric curriculum. We've been studying nothing but white for decades. Well, this is a different kind of whiteness studies. The whiteness studies study the systematic effect of white superiority that tries to be invisible. So these are very valuable studies because they do make the invisible visible. So from the Oxford Research Encyclopedia, critical whiteness studies is a growing field of scholarship whose aim is to reveal the invisible structures that produce and reproduce white supremacy and privilege. Yeah, this is great. If you're studying invisibility, you have to make it visible. And this is a helpful thing in the process toward race unity. Whiteness is a category of identity that is most useful when its very existence is denied. And you will hear it denied all the time. Although it has been studied, it has been observed, it has been documented, it has been measured, and it has been found wanting. So to recap, what I learned is racism is a corrosion affecting the whole structure of American society. Nobody escapes. The foundation of racism is this sense of white superiority, which is usually inherent, isn't necessarily conscious, strives to stay invisible, and is routinely denied. So there's this whole invisibility factor built in. Therefore, a white person can be anti-racist and work sacrificially for racial justice, be a white progressive or be a Bahá'í, and still manifest racist attitudes and actions that come from a usually inherent and not necessarily conscious sense of white superiority. Okay, so you could be aggressively working for race unity in your community. You could be studying with people the principles of the vision of race unity and doing it in a way that exercises your sense and manifests your sense of white superiority. Wow, right? Okay, so how might that manifest? Shoghi Effendi gives us information on that. In continuing, okay, I'm going to review that one statement. Let the white make a supreme effort in their resolve to contribute their share to the solution of this problem, to abandon once and for all their usually inherent and at times subconscious sense of superiority. And here we go. To correct their tendency toward revealing a patronizing attitude toward the members of the other race. All right, this is foundational to the sense of white superiority, a patronizing attitude. Definition of patronizing: apparently kind or helpful, but betraying a feeling of superiority, or condescending could be a synonym. Let's look at what that might look like some more. I think that this is a helpful diagram. So we have this triangle of racism. At the top, we have overt racism, which is very visible to white people. Then under it, we have covert racism, somewhat visible to white people, often denied. And at the bottom, we have the least visible to white people, usually denied. In the literature, these are called microaggressions. And then down at the very bottom, the base, we have the usually inherent and at times subconscious sense of white superiority. Okay, so a patronizing attitude could look like interrupting a person of color, speaking for people of color, the white savior complex. And if you don't know what that is, look it up and study it. The assumption that white is better in whatever you're looking at. The belief that I can do it best as a white person. Fear or avoidance of people of color. Belief in meritocracy. That's the belief that you have to pull yourself up by your own bootstraps and there are no forces in society that are keeping you down except your own lack of initiative. Belief in meritocracy. Speaking down to people of color. Minimizing the Black experience of oppression. So that could be, well, there weren't that many people killed, or yeah, but you weren't a slave, or any number of things that minimizes the Black experience of oppression. The statement, but we're just one human family, and thinking that, proclaiming that makes it all okay. So there's naivety in there. Denying white privilege. Okay, so all of these things are very covert, racist, patronizing, condescending attitudes and actions that are extremely common. Okay, the next level up, covert racism, which is somewhat visible to white people, but still often denied. Racial profiling, school to prison pipeline, discriminatory lending, discriminatory housing, discriminatory hiring, Eurocentric curriculum, lack of representation in government and other arenas. So while the statistics may show one thing, people may argue that, well, no, that's not racist. This has to do with the economy or with any number of things. Okay, so then we have at the top the very overt racism, which is the murders of Black people, marches for white supremacy, hate crimes of all kinds. And these are usually now against the law, not socially acceptable, usually, but they are extremely visible to white people, and it's very clear that these are racist actions. Okay, so I think that these levels of visibility are important. If I am ignorant of the way that racism manifests, if I think that racism is only the intentional, violent actions of wretchedly mean people, then I could believe that I am free of racial prejudice because I don't engage in violent activities against colored people. And I probably won't recognize my own sense of white superiority that is foundational to structural racism. Okay. So it's important to know that there's a lot more below the water, if you will. The iceberg above the water could be the overt racism, but there's a lot more underneath that white people support if they don't challenge their own sense of white superiority. And here's the paradox of white progressives. Because I believe that racism is wrong, fear of being seen as racist will make me resistant to seeing my complicity with it. I will deny any implication that I am racially prejudiced, and I'll defend my moral correctness if some racial slight is pointed out that I'm responsible for. Here's another way of putting it. White people's moral objection to racism increases their resistance to acknowledging their complicity with it. If I'm looking for racism outside of myself, if I'm thinking because racism is so heinous, I cannot possibly have that in me at all. If I'm looking outward, I'm not going to see it in myself, and I'll refuse to see it in myself because it's so wretchedly bad. Okay. This is from Robin, this is all from Robin DiAngelo from the book White Fragility. And it's excellent study. And she states, I believe that white progressives cause the most daily damage to people of color. Why would that be? It's the constant microaggressions that discourage, that ignore, that these constant microaggressions that underlie the structural racism and that are a constant battle that people of color have to fight against. Okay. So shocking, right? I believe that white progressives cause the most daily damage to people of color. Now, in the Baha'i writings, Shoghi Effendi says that the solution to the problem of racial prejudice requires supreme effort, ceaseless exertions, extreme tact and wisdom, moral courage, vigilance. Okay, so there is no quick fix. If I say, declare my belief in Baha'u'llah, or declare my belief in Jesus Christ and all his radical teachings on equity, and I say we're all one human family, I can do that and I can believe that. But is that the supreme effort, the ceaseless exertion, the extreme tact and wisdom? Does that require moral courage? The solution is long-standing. It's going to take a lot of work, and declaring belief in something doesn't satisfy the requirements. So I'm saying there's no quick fix, and working toward the solution is going to be and should be uncomfortable. Ceaseless exertions are uncomfortable. Stating my belief in the oneness of humanity does not rid me of a lifetime of racist socialization. So I learned that this is something that I have to attend to, and proactively. So while working with Rick on his book, I was really struck by the profound generosity of African Americans who willingly associate with white people. Because of white blindness, there is an African American forgiveness that happens on a regular basis that white people, I tell you, are oblivious to. And this came out again and again in the many people that I interviewed for Rick's book. Yeah, so let's look. We have a study group here. We could call it a study circle, and it is a group that has some diversity in it. And they're meeting, maybe they're studying the vision of race unity. And somebody in the study group, a white person, states, I don't see race. I was raised to be colorblind. And they're proud of that. And they have no idea how offensive that statement is to the people of color in the room. So why? Why is that offensive? I'm going to let Carlo Rodriguez from the Mexican soccer team tell you. He says, I see no color is not the goal. I see your color and I honor you. I value your input. I will be educated about your lived experiences as a colored person. I will work against the racism that harms you. You are beautiful. Tell me how to do better. That's the goal. Now, this phenomenon of racism without racists, okay, people claiming to be colorblind, is a thing. And it is a different kind of racism. It's the subtle microaggression racism. And there's a whole book about it, and there are other books as well. But this one, Racism Without Racists, Colorblind Racism and the Persistence of Racism in America, by Eduardo Bonilla Silva. This is a good treatment of that topic. So if you've ever patted yourself on the back, you know, so, well, I don't see color, we need to rethink this because it's not the goal. The person who claimed to be colorblind in that study group probably won't get feedback on that statement. And why not? I will get to why not in a minute, but first I want to note that to explain the racial injustice that surrounded them, Rick's mother explained to her children that white people can't see us, but we can see them. Okay, this is another spin on I can't see color, or I was raised not to see color. Yes, Rick was raised to understand that white people couldn't see him. Okay, so not seeing color is not a tradition that we need to continue. And a whole book could be written on this, about the history of this. Okay, so again, the person who claims to be colorblind probably won't get feedback on the racial impact of that statement, because white progressives usually do not welcome feedback on the racial impact of their words or actions. Okay, and people of color who've been trying to tell white people this for decades know this very well. They've been navigating these waters for a long time. Feedback isn't given because it probably won't be accepted. What happens instead is, well, a response like, well, that's not what I meant. Or, but I can't be racist because I have a Black friend, or because I work with this group, or because my uncle married a Black woman. No. Or you don't understand, or my intention was good, or then complete avoidance of whoever challenged them, and often tears that then result in the white woman usually being attended to by those around her because now she's been hurt. It's people of color, I can tell you, are exhausted by white blindness, denial, and defensiveness. So let's go back to the concerns of the youth in 1969. How could the community move forward when many white Baha'is were blind to the reality of racial oppression, as well as blind to their own prejudicial attitudes and actions? Okay, now you notice this group of youth, they're not blind to it. People of color are not blind to the white racist attitudes and actions that come from the sense of superiority. They are not blind to them. And you know, if you see a problem, you can work to solve it. If you can't see the problem, or if you refuse to see the problem, then the problem continues to control you. And others who do see it, like this stellar group of youth, they can't help you. So how frustrating this has been for the people of color for years and years and years. Okay, so now get back to Grace Vonderheit's wonderful response. She said, yes, I am prejudiced, and I'm trying to do something about it. And after some time, I began to understand why Rick loved and admired her so much. I can't tell you how much he admires Grace. So Grace admitted her racial prejudice. Hallelujah. It was no secret to the youth. And when she admitted it, they had something in common. They both saw the same thing. And it concerned both of them, all of them. Okay, it's crazy making to say, yes, you're prejudiced, and to hear, no, no, no. It's gaslighting, it's crazy making. But to admit it and say, oh, yes, I am prejudiced, then that was a real gift to their relationship. And then Grace declares that she's trying to root out that prejudice. She's trying to do something about it. You know, when she went on pilgrimage in the 1960s, she said that she would pray to God to help her abandon these feelings of racism and her sense of white superiority. Okay, she was very upfront with that. Yes, so what's not to love? Okay, she continued associating with those who named her prejudice. She didn't try to hide or avoid them. She's just very honest. She accepted the feedback, accepted it as the gift that it was. And then she demonstrated change. Yeah, Rick said that then she did start giving rides to the African American youth and other things about her attitudes or actions. They could tell she was making progress. They loved Grace. Grace saw the truth. Now, before working on this story with Rick, I felt that racial prejudice was an enemy that was apart from me. I was above racism. Racism was an outside problem that had to be tackled. So like the girl here in this image, I was just barely touching the problem of racism and trying to tackle it, but I was above it. Now, I'm learning that I am a part of a corrosive system of racism, and I can't be unaffected. No one can. I have been socialized into a sense of white superiority and been groomed to be blind to it. That was part of the process. And now I'm responsible for my new understanding. Okay, so when I'm living in a corroded situation, it's like, what do you do? And there's all this darkness. Okay, so first of all, through working on crossing the line with Rick, I have learned to say, I realize that because I'm white, there are racial dynamics that I don't see. And that is a tremendous relief, because that leaves me open to being informed, and it takes away the denial and defensiveness. Now I can appreciate people helping me with my blindness, filling in where I just don't see. And I share that realization with other white people. And this is, I believe, an important conversation that white people need to have with white people. It's like, you know what? Because we're white, there are racial dynamics that we don't see. We need to educate ourselves about that. This is James Baldwin back in the 1950s. And so he said, if I love you, I have to make you conscious of the things you don't see. And so if we love other white people, we have to make them conscious of the things that they don't see. People of color have been trying to do this for a long time. It's on us. Okay, now also, instead of ruminating on all the reasons why I can't be prejudiced, which I recall doing time and again in various situations, I've learned to think of myself as a recovering racist who has a long way to go and is grateful for helpful insights. So what if I had to make my way up the middle of this rocky stream? I know help would be appreciated. And I appreciate that this isn't going to be easy or comfortable. I was at a panel one time on religion and racism, and the Methodist minister introduced himself. He told his name, and then he said, I'm a recovering racist. Yeah, we all had to say a little something about ourselves. He said his name, and I'm a recovering racist. That was a learning point for everyone. I appreciated that so much. He was a white minister. And what he did was really help to advertise the fact that this is a system that we're all involved in. And nobody is above being socialized into racism in a structural racism society. Okay, coming to the close here. Instead of trying to prove that I am not a racist, I choose to be a proactive part of the solution by making the invisible visible. I have learned to say, I realize that I have been raised in a racist society based on white domination, and I have been socialized to not see it. I'd appreciate feedback on anything I might say or do that you feel has a racist impact. I promise that I will listen to you and respond with, thank you. And to Rick and to all the many people who I interviewed for Rick's book, I would like to say, thank you. And that is the end of this presentation.
So much, JoAnn. I think that the points that you made are really turning people's wheels. We have a lot of questions coming in, and I thought that I could field some of these questions to you if that's all right.
Okay, yeah, that's fine.
Okay. Let's see here. Our first question is, how are white superiority and white supremacy different, and how are they the same?
Mm-hmm. I think that they are very much the same, and if there are particular differences in the definitions, I would look to the experts in the field. So to say that we have a system of, we could say we have a system of white superiority, a system of white supremacy, a culture of white supremacy. To me, those mean the same things. But if there's some little nuance of definition, I think you need to go to the experts.
Perfect, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Our second question is, it seems like racism is inherently present in all humans. Is that a safe statement to say?
You know, I think there are a lot of studies on that. There's a book I recently got saying, "Are we all born racist?" And I don't have any qualifications to answer that. I will say, though, you know, it kind of it reminds me of what this presentation was not about. Shoghi Effendi, he gives guidance to white people to how to work to the solution of racial prejudice. And he also gives guidance to African Americans on what their role is to contribute to the solution of racial prejudice. And you'll notice that that was not part of this presentation. It is in Rick's book. I mean, that's addressed and discussed in Rick's book. But I have found that as a white person, if I start thinking about what somebody else's responsibility is in terms of a solution to the racial problem, what African American responsibility is, being human, I tend to latch onto that. And so I'm just trying to protect myself against going out of my arena. You know, Dr. William Smith, you may know him as Smitty. He says that the Bahá'í writings tell the white people what to do, and they tell the black people what to do. And we need to stick with our own what. As soon as I start thinking about somebody else's what, I'm off track already. So, you know, so that's an interesting question. Are we born racist? I can't respond to that exactly, but I can. I'd just like to say that it's good to focus on our current condition and what's going on right now and who we are and what it is we need to do.
Mm-hmm. It reminds me of that story The Guardian tells of Shoghi Effendi, you know, about keeping your eye on your own row.
Yes.
When you're farming, you look at somebody else's row and your row immediately goes crooked.
Thank you. Right.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. And whether we are automatically born racist doesn't mean we don't work on it.
Mm-hmm.
I think we're sort of born selfish too, but we have to work on that a lot. So and nothing gets us out of our task.
As a mother of a 3-year-old, I can say that's very true.
There you go.
All right, our next question is, what are some of the most effective ways to root out an inherited, not inherent, but inherited sense of superiority?
Mm-hmm. Ooh, Jessica, what do you think? An inherent, what are the best ways to, okay, well, all I have is my own experience.
Sure.
And I have the words, I don't know, on a Post-it note on a lot of my walls. There's a prayer from Baha'u'llah that starts, I know not, I know not. And I really like those words. I know not. So reading and studying the Baha'i writings will certainly help to put us in our place. And specifically for racism, to claim, to make it public, to tell your white friends. You know, I've discovered that I have been, and that I believe we all are, socialized into this system of white superiority, and talk about it and make it visible. It's most potent when it's denied and subconscious. So what I've tried to do is to create spaces to talk about the sense of white superiority and how we're socialized into it and what that looks like. Just trying to make it visible and part of the normal conversation. And then I've also, with my Black friends who I'm very close with, I invite feedback. And when my friends are sure that I'm not going to have a knee-jerk type of reaction to pointing out something that I say that has racist implications, when they know that I'm grateful, then it's easy for them to do that. But you've got to, I think, be really good friends with somebody to ask them to do that for you, especially now.
Yeah, for sure, for sure. It also reminds me of that. There's a saying, something about like, it's not right, it's white.
Yeah.
And I think we need to start asking ourselves, you know, something that we think is right, it might just be white. Just might be white culture. And so starting to ask ourselves those questions.
Yeah, I agree.
All right, our next question is, do you have any advice on how to talk to other white people about our hidden racism?
I started a book club with a friend, with Judy Goodwin, Lorene Knoll, and a couple other people. It was open. We invited a diverse group, but it ended up to be a small group of white women. And we read the book, So You Want to Talk About Race, by Ijeoma Oluo. And it's meant to be eye-opening to white people, and it was. And I think the four of us came into it with different degrees of understanding about what racism was, but it was all a very good conversation. And the book is designed to ask you questions and to put your life into the things, you know, that she's pointing out. So I'm a big fan of book clubs, of course. I mean, I like to read and I like to study, and so that's good. If it can be tough, but if you just try, you know, if you have a friend you've never talked about this, bring up the topic. You know, I was watching this webinar the other day and it really struck me. I don't know, it struck a chord in me that I believe it's true, that we are raised in this culture of white supremacy, and there's a lot of things that we don't know about that. It's really subconscious. Just start the conversation, see where it goes.
Yeah. It also occurs to me, I wonder, you know, if you, like you were saying earlier, if you're really close friends with somebody who's white, you could ask them, do you want to like help each other? and acknowledge when we see in the other person something that might have racist implications that they're not aware of.
Yes. Yes. Yeah. That's what our book club ended up doing, and that was been helpful. Yeah.
Wow. It's like a white recovery support group.
Yeah, I mean, it seems like it's something that ought to happen in the in communities like the Bahá'í communities that is integrated, and that the white people should help each other to do that. It seems like that could be a natural part of the conversation.
And what a shift, you know, from going to don't attack me to please help me.
Right.
We see it as help rather than an attack we have to defend against.
Yes.
Yeah. All right. So this next question, for folks who might not be familiar with the Baha'i community, there are a lot of folks from the Middle East, from Iran. And this question is, what have you learned about the role of Persians in this effort to abandon a usually inherent and at times subconscious sense of superiority?
Okay. Well, a few things come to mind. I mean, if these are Persians in the United States, they might think, well, you know, you're talking about European Americans and we're more Asian, or that there's, you could read studies on passing for white. Yeah, so it's a whole dynamic where people who are not, as I say, European Americans, because of their skin coloring, maybe because of their education, because of their business, I mean, any number of factors, they pass for white in that they are allowed the same privileges that white people have, that they aren't harassed by police, or they aren't followed in stores, or that people don't undermine their opinions, or any number of things. So whiteness is a category that goes beyond just European Americans. It's a status, and it can be achieved in a variety of ways. So, and skin color does have a lot to do with it. But just because, say, if I was Persian American, it wouldn't mean that I didn't benefit from the culture of white supremacy. Yeah. And you know, as far as like Persian culture and how racist issues in Persian cultures that Persians may be socialized into, I'm not Persian and I wouldn't know about that.
Gotcha. All right, thank you. Our next question is, this may seem like semantics, but I have a sense that a lot of people are thinking about this just from the questions we're getting. So I thought I'd address it, or that we'd address it. So it says, would you say that I have racism and I'm trying to heal would be the same as I am a racist? To me, saying I am says it is part of my being, but we are not the dust on our mirrors. We are noble beings realizing our true identity. Purifying our mirrors is our job, and racism is a part of the dust we need to clean off. However, another viewer also says, we are so scared of being labeled racist. We need to get over that. It is automatically in all of us. So it seems like folks are struggling with, you know, do I say I am racist, or I struggle with racism? These are the questions.
Yeah. I'm comfortable saying I realize that I have been raised in a racist society, and therefore there are racial implications on things that I don't see. I'm comfortable saying I realize that I have been socialized into a culture of white supremacy, and that manifests in many ways that are in racist attitudes and actions that I'm not aware of. You know, saying I am racist, still, to me, that has connotations of lynchings and murders and let's make America white again, and things that I, I don't want, of course I can't associate with that are immoral things. But I don't know that that's necessary to say that. Just find your own words. My words aren't necessarily the right words for somebody else. I think to say I'm a recovering racist gets attention. Because, I mean, anybody who knows me knows that I work for race equity and proactively, and not just in the Baha'i community, but also in the greater community. And so I might say that specifically to get the attention of some white people, to inquire about what is that about. Now, if I say I'm a recovering racist to a Black audience, that's not even going to get any kind of rise, because they would know that. They know that, and they know that white progressives still are guilty of these microaggressions that they haven't recovered out of yet. Okay, so it's no surprise to people of color that I'm a recovering racist.
Nice. Yeah.
Yeah, but to say that to white people who know me, it could get their attention and start a conversation about exactly what that means.
Yeah. Yeah. Sounds like intent is important there.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Okay, our next question is, what do we do to overcome our own personal white fragility?
Okay, so white fragility is the knee-jerk reaction of I can't be prejudiced, and the fear of being seen as racist. Okay, so it's a fear. How do you get over fear? To me, I think that I know that in the past I was fragile, because in the past, when some things would come to my attention that had situations that didn't work out well, that had racial overtones, I would sort of have these circular thoughts of all the reasons why I couldn't be racist, and it wasn't my fault. Actually, after working with Rick on his books, I started having flashbacks to many incidences like that, that now I understand much more clearly. So I would say that I was characterized by that fragility and defensiveness, and I don't feel that in me now, but I have had so many conversations in doing Rick's book for 3 years, talking with people of color and white people about their experiences of racism, that I've just interviewed it out of me. I mean, I'm grateful when I can be grateful when something is pointed out. And to me, it's like, well, this adds to the research. I mean, yeah. I'm not, I think that to have conversations gets you less fragile. I think that was a long way to say, you need to talk more about it.
Yeah. Yeah. And it sounds like, a lot of what I took from your talk has to do with this, actually, that, if we see racism as white people doing bad things,
right,
then if somebody points out to me that I'm doing something racist, of course, I might feel fragile and be defensive. But if I understand that racism is a system, and that I'm a part of that system, and that it's not of my choosing, but that I've been brainwashed, I'm gonna be a lot less fragile about it and take it a lot less personally. But I'm going to work on it, obviously.
That's right. I mean, who doesn't want to know more about themselves, right?
Right.
It's like, oh, whoa, thank you. I totally missed that.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah.
Oh, thanks.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's good.
Thank you. All right, we are nearing the end of our questions here. Someone asks, do you feel that the Baha'i writings see racism as a mental illness?
Oh, yes. Actually, I'm not sure about mental illness. In the Universal House of Justice's message to world religious leaders in 2002, the House of Justice does refer to racism as a spiritual disease.
Mm.
Yeah, I think that's pretty impressive.
Mm-hmm.
Spiritual disease. So I think spiritual disease and mental illness is sort of the same kind of tone to it. Read The Advent of Divine Justice by Shoghi Effendi. Read the whole thing. There's much in there, much in there about America specifically and the problem of racial prejudice and all the different ways to look at it.
Perfect. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Someone's wondering if there are book study discussion questions for your book.
You know what? We really need to have those exact questions.
Mm.
And I need to write them. And if anyone has any suggestions about what kind of questions to come up with, let me know. I am easy to get in touch with. My website address is on the slide presentation, and my email address is JoAnnBorovicka@gmail.com. It's easy, just have to know how to spell Borovicka. But I think that that study questions for this book would be a really excellent tool. It's meant for young people. We hope that it would be used by junior youth groups and other youth endeavors.
That actually, oh, sorry.
Go ahead.
That actually brings us perfectly to our second to last question, which
Okay.
is your book especially for white youth, Black youth, or what?
Yeah, it's especially for everybody.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah, crossing the line. So it has Black people in it, it has white people in it, it has, it's exciting, it's filled with action. The white people who have read it come out differently. Rick, I don't know, you start the book and you fall in love with this young teenager, and then all this stuff happens and you really feel his adventures. And it's instructional. It's very instructional on so many levels. But yes, white people enjoy the book and they learn a lot. Black people enjoy the book and they learn a lot. And it's for everybody.
Excellent, thank you. And then our last question, can you talk to the need of making friendships with people of a perceived different race?
Oh, talk to the need. Well, it's needful. I mean, in the Baha'i writings, we're told to do that, and to be sincere in our attempts at friendship, and also to be patient. Let's see. Yeah, here, I've got this here. We looked at a few of Shoghi Effendi's passages, and I wish we could have read them all. After the part where Shoghi Effendi talks about a patronizing attitude and that we need to drop that, Shoghi Effendi says to persuade people of color through our intimate, spontaneous, and informal association with them. Okay, so white people's intimate, informal association with people of color. That's the next thing to do. It's important. And then he says also, and to master the white people's, to master their own impatience of any lack of responsiveness on the part of people of color. He says, master their impatience with any lack of responsiveness on the part of a people who have received for so long a period such grievous and slow healing wounds. Okay, so yes, after it's important to make friends with people who are perceived as being racially different, and it's important to be patient with their lack of responsiveness. And I just like to close, that just brings to mind, in one of the interviews I did for Rick's book, I was talking with an African-American woman. She was a Bahá'í, and she remembered the time when her first baby was born. And she was in a small Bahá'í community that had whites and blacks in it, and she had served on the assembly with the white people and served in the community with the white people and worked with the white people and celebrated Bahá'í holy days and feasts with the white people. When her baby was born, it took every bit of strength she had to allow the white women to hold her baby. So when Shoghi Effendi talks about grievous and slow healing wounds, these go back generations. And that's the kind of patience that's required. Yeah, so we're to master our impatience. If, that it's complicated.
Yeah. And with that, JoAnn, I really want to thank you for showing up for all of us here today and sharing your learnings and your insights and being vulnerable. And that, I think it's so interesting how when we're vulnerable, we're not fragile in that way.
That's true.
Yeah. So thank you so much.
Nothing to hide.
Yeah, love it. And I love that you have sticky notes all over that say, I don't know.
I don't know.
I love it. Thank you so much. And thank you to all of our viewers at home. And please do visit JoAnn's website and purchase the book. And please, if you want to, you can also email Greenacre at greenacre@usbnc.org with any comments or questions you may have. And with that, have a great day, everybody. Thank you so much, JoAnn.
Thank you, Jessica.